Hey there everyone, welcome back to Utility Sports. Super stoked to be talking about the Detroit Pistons in today's video. We're going to focus on a trade guide centered all around Detroit Pistons basketball. And listen, if you're a Detroit fan in general, I know you guys have been going through it with the Pistons for quite some time, and I'm super happy for you guys that the Lions have had such a great season. There's a lot to celebrate right now in Detroit, so if you're a Pistons fan and a Detroit fan in general, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more. Let's get some hype for Detroit sports down in the comment section below. I know the Pistons haven't been playing very well, but there's a lot of positives right now in Detroit, and there's a lot of things to be looking forward to going forward. And let's jump into it here with a video preview. What are we going to discuss here with the Pistons trade guide today? Well, we're going to look at the Pistons through a historical context. Most teams, I just talk about their current situation. I think pretty much everyone is well aware on the Pistons' current situation, so I think looking at them historically is a little bit better. We're going to also talk about their draft pick situation. What picks do they own? What picks do they currently owe out to other teams? We're going to look at their multi-year cap table. What is kind of going on in Detroit? Who do they have under contract? Who's an expiring contract? And what does that kind of lead us to believe could potentially happen within not only the next month or so leading up to the trade deadline, but also what are they going to do this offseason? And does a buy now move actually make any sense at all for Troy Weaver and the Detroit Pistons? We're going to discuss that very briefly in this video. Then really the big question, and I think this is one that a lot of people want to know, including Tom Gores, when they're going to sit down with Troy Weaver at the end of the year, they're going to ask him what his plan is. And I feel like I have a pretty good idea what that plan is going to end up looking like and how he's going to try going about improving this team and saving his own job. We'll talk about that in this video quite a bit. We'll also talk about their tradable assets. What could I see them get on the open market for some of those players? And we'll conclude with our final predictions in this video. Let's jump into it now with our historical context around the Detroit Pistons. At the date I'm recording this, which is Friday, January 26th at 10 p.m. Central Time, the Pistons are 5-39. They are terrible, which is okay. Listen, I prompted everyone on Twitter. I wanted to know who was going to win more games this year, the Detroit Lions in a 17-game season or the Detroit Pistons in an 82-game season. And a lot of people were betting on the Lions. That's kind of how this season's going for the Detroit Pistons, which is okay. It's been kind of a disaster. I already have a video up on the channel kind of raking into some of their issues and some of the things that Monty Williams isn't doing very well as a head coach, and that list is quite long. And if we're going to look at them through a historical lens, I think it's best to compare them to some of the worst records in NBA history, because that's kind of the conversation we're in here. The Charlotte Bobcats hold the record for the least amount of wins in a season, with 7 wins only and 59 losses in the 2011-12 season. That was a lockout year, so teams only played 66 games. The 76ers, though, hold the second and third worst records in terms of total wins in a season, but the 76ers actually lost a lot more games as well in that process. In 1972 and 73, they went 9-73, an absolutely abysmal season for themselves. And then the 76ers under Sam Hinkie won just 10 games as they were trusting the process. And listen, I'm sure a lot of Pistons fans aren't trusting the process right now in Detroit, but there are still some positive things that I've seen from this team, and I do believe in overall the talent that's on the roster. Now, Monty Williams has to be more creative in finding ways to make that talent work together on both ends of the floor. I think a defensive scheme change and overhaul is essential for this Pistons team to be able to do anything at any point moving forward. We'll see if they ever figure that out or not. I'm a little skeptical on that. The offensive spacing is what it is. It's going to be a challenge when you're starting a whole bunch of non-shooters or kind of relatively poor shooters for perimeter players. There's going to be an uphill battle there, but they have talent. There's a lot of good young talent on this team, and there's a lot of ways this team can improve over the next 12 months or so, which is really what I want to focus on. First of all, their future draft pick situation is pretty clear. They do owe their first round pick to the New York Knicks, but there are massive protections on it all the way through 2027. It's top 18 protected this year, top 13 protected in the 2025 NBA draft, top 11 protected in the 2026 draft, and then ultimately top 9 protected in the 2027 draft. So on the bright side, if the Pistons remain bad forever, they'll get all of their own picks still, because they're likely not going to convey any of those to the New York Knicks. And with that, they would end up sending, I believe, a second round pick out the door to the Knicks in 2027 if none of these first rounders can ever convey, which with the way the Pistons brand of basketball has been going over the last 5-10 years, that's a real possibility, which isn't great for the fans. It would be a lot better to make the playoffs and send the 17th pick in the draft to New York at some point than what's currently going on in Detroit. Not to be a little harsh or anything, but right now the product's been very bad. But otherwise, they control their own future. So even with the fact that they owe these picks out to New York with protections on it, they don't owe like unprotected picks anywhere, which is a really good thing. That's like a huge positive, because anytime you're thinking about the Detroit Pistons, you would kind of assume they screwed everything up. They haven't screwed this up too terribly yet, so that's a real positive for this franchise. When we're looking at their multi-year cap table, well, they're slated to have up to around $77 million in cap space, and that's with where they're currently at before the trade deadline this year, and they have possibilities of opening up even more money if they do something pretty drastic, although I'm not exactly sure they will. But that $77 million in cap space is super important, and we'll talk about that a bit later in this video. First of all, anytime you're looking at their cap table, the most important player to bring up right now, in my opinion, is Bojan Bogdanovic, who they got in a trade with the Utah Jazz a little bit over a year and a half ago. They got him in for Kelly Olynyk, who is another big trade target this year at the deadline for a bunch of teams. I'm sure a lot of teams are going to have interest in Olynyk across the league. And Bogdanovic, I think his market's cooled off a bit. We'll talk about his trade value here, but he's on a $20 million contract this season, down to about $19.1 million next year or so. And that is completely non-guaranteed. So if a team wanted to, they could realistically trade for Bojan Bogdanovic this year and basically incur almost zero dead money going into next season. So he could be a short-term rental for a team, or a team could trade for him with the plans of keeping him around not only this year, but next season as well, which I think is a big positive for Detroit in any trade negotiations. Then there are core pieces. These are the kind of key guys that I can't see them at all being willing to part with, at least not yet. Cade Cunningham, Jaden Ivey, Jalen Duren, Ausar Thompson, and Isaiah Stewart. Now, there are some conflicting reports about the Pistons maybe looking to make a buy now move and improve the roster drastically this trade deadline. We'll talk about my thoughts on that in a second, but I've seen Jaden Ivey's name floated. I've seen Ausar Thompson's name floated. I'm not going to buy into those reports. I don't really believe that those guys are going to be that easily available, that readily available for a trade like that. If they make a trade like that, it's a disaster, to be honest with you. If they give up Jaden Ivey or Ausar Thompson, oh my goodness. Like, those guys aren't the problem right now. They're very young. Give them some time. What they do have is a lot of expirings that could help teams. Joe Harris, he makes about $19 million. I don't think there's really a market there unless the Pistons trade his contract and eat up some of their cap space by taking in longer-term salary and then maybe get a couple of draft picks that way. That could be a real possibility. James Wiseman is headed toward restricted free agency this offseason. If they keep James Wiseman around on any number higher than the minimum, I would be kind of shocked. I just don't know if there's a real market out there for him anywhere. Alec Burks is a player that we'll touch on when it comes to his trade value, as well as Monte Morris. All of these expiring players are guys that Detroit should be looking to trade and seeing if they could extrapolate any type of draft pick compensation for them. Because looking at the list, there's not anyone there that I'm like, yeah, that's a key piece for the Pistons moving forward. In fact, most of them I would say it's okay if they trade them, and it would probably be better if they do. Killian Hayes, Mike Muscala, Danilo Gallinari. Of course, they just landed Muscala and Danilo in a trade with the Wizards, so those two guys cannot be aggregated with other salaries, and my assumption is Muscala and Gallinari are there to stay the rest of the year in Detroit. And then Kevin Knox as well, because Troy Weaver can't help himself if he sees a player who was a former lottery pick or a former top 20 pick who becomes easily available because he's not very good. Troy Weaver has to jump on that opportunity and say, I'm going to get that value back out of him. And then honestly, he never does, but he at least feels good about himself trying to do that. So that's the Troy Weaver special. Let's get into it here now with the question on, are the Pistons making a buy now move? And would that be centered around someone like Dejounte Murray or Zach LaVine? Here's kind of the details. If they're trading for Dejounte Murray, there's going to either be a draft pick in there that they shouldn't be sending out because they're not very good right now, and Atlanta would probably be willing to jump all over that. Or you're also looking at a situation where they're giving up young pieces like Jaden Ivey, like Jalen Duren, which, I mean, oh my goodness, could you imagine if they trade Jalen Duren? Like Isaiah Stewart, who I think is a little bit more expendable, but again, you're a 5-win team halfway through the season. Why are you trying to trade for a guy right now that's going to help you win? That makes absolutely zero sense. I know there's going to be that pride factor. The owner doesn't want to be the owner of the worst team ever in a single season. The GM doesn't want to be a part of that. Of course, Monty Williams doesn't want to be the head coach that led them there. the reality is they're not very good right now. And trading for Dejounte Murray, not only is that not going to make it better, it might make it worse. It actually might. Because then now you're trading for a veteran who wants to win, who's on a team that's not capable of winning, and all of a sudden I feel like there's going to be locker room issues. That's like one of the few positives here about Detroit's situation. That's one of the few things Monty Williams, I think, does very well as a head coach. He's a locker room guy. And with that, even though the team has been horrendous and terrible and just flat out kind of the worst team I can really remember watching in the NBA, like, there's still like hope in the organization and in the locker room. The players aren't blaming each other. In fact, it seems like they're working through a lot of this together. The moment you make a big splash trade out some young guys for someone like Dejounte Murray, the goal should be to flip to winning. And not only do I think Dejounte Murray's a bad fit in Detroit, I don't think he's a good enough player to all of a sudden uplift this roster into a 40-50 win team. In fact, I don't know if he's good enough to make them a 35-win team or a 30-win team just with how bad they've been this season. I like Dejounte Murray a lot as a player. Detroit is not the right spot for him. He doesn't fit super well with Cade Cunningham, in my opinion. I just really don't understand the whole point of bringing him in. I understand the mid-range shot making is very attractive. He's shooting the three ball at a career-high clip. I just don't think it moves the needle enough for Atlanta to really warrant giving up young talent and or draft pick compensation. It would be absolutely ludicrous to me. Zach LaVine, on the other hand, this is a little bit of a different discussion here. Zach LaVine, if you're trading for him, my assumption is you're almost eating his contract for Chicago. What does the Zach LaVine trade look like? It might look something like Bojan Bogdanovic plus other salary that is near expiring, plus maybe one small asset in there. Maybe one guy that the Bulls are like, hey, this could be a player that we try and find value out of. Could that be Killian Hayes? If you're a Pistons fan, you should be rooting for this. Even though, listen, Zach LaVine's on a massive contract. This is going to eat up a ton of your long-term cap space. This really mitigates what the Pistons are going to be able to do in free agency if they operate this way. But at the same time, Zach LaVine is a two-time All-Star, really talented player. He's a talented shooter. I think he fits actually really well next to Cade Cunningham on the offensive end. This doesn't make Detroit any better defensively. In fact, it probably makes them even a little bit worse, which is unimaginable to me, but somehow it probably does. And listen, while LaVine, like, I think a lot of people are way too low on him. If you look at him from like an analytic perspective and really just kind of evaluating his shooting splits and the way that he's able to get his shot off against pretty tough defenses, like, LaVine's a really good scorer and a really good shooter. And I think that's one thing that if you're looking for a player who can toggle between being an on-ball scorer and an off-ball scorer, LaVine's actually one of the more easily attainable players who fits both of those roles. And he does it at a very high efficiency level. I think he's honestly a really underrated player, but his contract is so massive, and with the new CBA, it's going to have a lot of limitations if you're a team that trades for that contract. So even if I think he's really talented and I think he's a little underrated across the league, at the same time, I would probably stay away from him myself just because of that contract and the limitations it puts on a franchise acquiring him, which is such a weird aspect of NBA basketball. It's not always just about talent. It's about how do you fit the talent in? How does the luxury tax affect you? How are you able to stay below the hard cap? You're trying to work across all of these different financial implications as well as just actual team building, which is hard enough on its own because you have to get players that fit. I think LaVine actually fits Detroit really well offensively, but again, the defensive side of the floor, just he's not going to be very well engaged. And honestly, if you're Zach LaVine and you've spent your whole career in Minnesota, a bad Chicago Bulls team, and now the Detroit Pistons, that's like a marathon of death. That is like the worst possible career route and trajectory you can ever have. And it would have Zach LaVine repeating the exact same thing he said on national TV the moment he was drafted by the Timberwolves. I'm sure someone will have gotten that joke. I hope so. If you did, let me know down in the comment section. Let's jump forward though. Now into Troy Weaver's plans. Outside of Zach LaVine, outside of Dejounte Murray, they've got really two options if they don't make some big trade this year at the deadline, which again, I really am against. I want to make sure I'm clear on that. I think it would be terrible for them. If they use cap space to eat salaries and accumulate draft picks, it could be a nice kind of movement place where they have a bunch of these expiring contracts and they're able to turn them into some draft compensation. Probably not a ton, but that's typically a pretty good route for teams to take. Although I really don't think it's the right route for this Detroit Pistons team because they're already so young. I already believe that they have a lot of young talent. What are a couple more second-round picks going to help them with? And typically, I'm very vocal about how I think second-rounders are a useful asset to have. For Detroit, I just don't believe it as much, especially given their circumstances. I think really the best route for them is to take the Houston Rockets approach, which is go into free agency, overpay veteran players who can actually help you win, and you get good contributors. Now, listen, last year I think the Houston Rockets got pretty lucky. It was a really strong free agency class, kind of all things considered. They were able to steal Dillon Brooks after a career bad playoffs where everyone was super low on him. They were able to get him while pretty much nobody else was willing to give him more than the mid-level exception, and the Houston Rockets are way better today because of that. You also look at getting Fred VanVleet. The Raptors were at a spot where they weren't comfortable paying him. They gave him a shorter-term, massive money deal, and they got him into Houston to kind of be their point guard while Amen Thompson develops. This is exactly what Detroit needs. Detroit needs 2 or 3 players who can shoot the basketball, can run the offense when one of Jaden Ivey or Cade Cunningham is either out with an injury or just not on the floor. They need one more ball handler, and they need just more floor spacing. This offseason, it's not going to be easy to get those guys, but Detroit's going to have the money to throw at somebody. Maybe a Tobias Harris. And Pistons fans are going to say, we already had Tobias Harris. I mean, Tobias Harris would make you better. He would give you a quality player that is a starting level player on a very good team right now in Philadelphia. He's not going to solve all of your problems, but he's going to put you in more competitive games just by having him on the roster. It's going to be a significant upgrade over, Isaiah Livers when he was there. It's going to be a significant upgrade over pretty much anyone else that's been a Detroit forward in the last 4 years, honestly. No disrespect to Isaiah Stewart, he's good, but he's more of a tweener big, right? So I'm talking more wing forward type players. Yes, overpaying Tobias Harris is not going to move you to an NBA title contending team, but it might get you closer to making the play-in. And at some point, Cade Cunningham and Jaden Ivey and Jalen Duren are going to have to play in some competitive games like that, and Tobias Harris could be a guy who maybe helps you get there. Trade chips. What are we going to see them actually do at the deadline from a trade perspective, and what are the value levels of some of their players? Bojan Bogdanovic, I view him as a high-value second-rounder, somewhere between pick 31 and pick 38 of the draft. And I know Pistons fans are going to say, whoa, we want to get at least a first-rounder. I just don't know if I see teams giving up first-round picks for Bojan Bogdanovic. I'm sorry. He just isn't a good defender. And, I mean, people are going to point to his offense, they're going to point to his shooting, they're going to point to his ability to post up mismatches. He does a lot of nice things on offense. He plays off the catch well. He's pretty comfortable with the ball in his hands on occasion. Not something you want to do a ton, but he's capable with it. And, again, you can attack mismatches with him to a certain extent. But at the same time, on the other end of the floor, he is his own mismatch. I mean, if you go back and turn on Utah Jazz film from any year that they got bounced in the playoffs, which was all of them, Bojan Bogdanovic was massively targeted and attacked and couldn't keep people from penetrating the paint off the dribble. And that's going to be an even bigger problem now because he's older, slower, and honestly, it's been a huge problem this year in Detroit that people around me, specifically, a lot of media members are saying, oh, well, it would be really good for Bojan to get off that team. I mean, yeah, it's good for anyone to get off the team just with how they're playing right now, and Monty Williams is not doing a good job. But at the same time, Bojan's part of the problem. Honestly, We tend to give these veterans passes on, oh, well, this guy, he's a veteran. He's stuck around in the league, so it's not his problem. I mean, he's supposed to be one of the leaders. He's supposed to be one of the guys kind of setting an example, and he's literally a revolving door on the perimeter, if we're being honest. Alec Burks, who had a really hot stretch for a while here, I think he's worth a couple of second-round picks. Not the same value as Bojan Bogdanovic, where I'm looking at a high-value second-round. I'm talking Burks is worth a couple of whatever seconds, pick 48 and pick 52, or pick 41 and pick 58. Whatever numbers they end up being, teams aren't going to give up pick 31 for Alec Burks, but they'd be willing to give up 2 whatever second rounders, maybe one in 2025 and one in 2028, something like that again doesn't move the needle a ton for the Pistons. But if you're able to sell these players and get any little bit of draft compensation, I think it's actually worth it. Monte Morris, low second round pick value for him, maybe 1 second rounder. I could see a team like Denver maybe being interested in bringing him back in, although I just don't really know if I see the reasoning for them to do something like that. I'm not sure if Monte Morris has a market this trade deadline, to be honest. Mike Muscala, low second round pick value, shooting big man, that already just warrants some interest across the league just because he's able to shoot the basketball. And then Killian Hayes. I think probably one of the most infamous moments on the channel here is when I gave the Pistons an F grade for drafting Killian Hayes, probably my best moment, and I said that they would forever regret passing on Tyrese Halliburton. That has aged very, very well, but here's the thing with Killian. the guy's just not good at the NBA level. I mean, he's got the size. I know he's active defensively. I think he's a very smart player, but his shot making is just so poor. It's really just so poor. He's just a career bad efficiency player. Like he doesn't shoot mid-rangers well. The 3-point shot never came around like a lot of draft hopefuls were kind of praying for when they evaluated him. And he doesn't finish at the rim. He doesn't get to the rim often, and when he does, he doesn't really finish there very well. So he's just a bad 3-level scorer. He doesn't score well on any of the 3 levels. I just can't see a team actually being interested in him. Maybe somebody like Milwaukee, just because Milwaukee could use a little bit more positional size and defensive versatility from their guards, especially with Brook Lopez and the way that they play drop coverage. A chase defender like Killian could help them, and they have enough offense to maybe mitigate some of his own issues in maybe like a 12-minute a game role. But I just think Detroit is not the spot for him. He doesn't fit off of Ivy. He doesn't fit off of Cade. He definitely doesn't fit off of Duren. So just me looking at this team, I just don't think Killian Hayes has any role on this team. So when it comes to my final predictions, I'm really looking at the Pistons being able to keep cap space open and operate in a way that they're going to be able to keep their flexibility this offseason to improve their roster through maybe overpaying a guy or two in free agency. And I know a lot of Pistons fans are probably going to groan at that. They're not going to be happy with, hey, you're admitting that they're going to overpay someone who doesn't really move the needle a ton. I understand, but at the same time, the Pistons need something to happen. They just, right now, they don't have any talent from a veteran standpoint. Like a Zach LaVine trade might end up helping them, which is really bizarre because it shouldn't help most teams. It really probably would hurt most teams, but the Pistons are that deep down in the dumpster right now that doing something for LaVine or something else like that, Dejounte Murray, I'm completely out on that idea for Detroit, but LaVine, at least the scoring probably helps Detroit offensively, but even then, I don't know. I think that they keep their cap space open, overpay in free agency, and honestly, they probably trade some of their expirings for second rounders and other less desirable expiring contracts. So, for example, trading Alec Burks for a second rounder or two and getting some matching salary back in a deal. Something like that where you're helping contenders out, you're building good relationships with other front offices, but at the same time, you're really just focusing on getting more draft capital, opening up more trade flexibility for yourself while carving out pieces of your roster right now that aren't going to be a long-term part of your organization, which, again, Alec Burks shouldn't be. I don't know if they'll keep him around or not, but if it came down to me, I would trade some of those guys for second rounders and look to replenish your veteran depth and get better veterans the next time around, guys who are actually starting quality players. And then from there, you can, really kind of reshuffle the deck and change the way this thing looks because it needs a lot of help for sure. Thank you all so much for watching. I really hope you guys did enjoy. If you did, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and we'll catch you in the very next Utility Sports video.